I am at Airbnb. I've been at Airbnb for 3 years, doing research on a bunch of different things, always about the guest experience, what it's like to travel on Airbnb. And this is about understanding how people tell stories, how travelers who use Airbnb tell stories about their travels. Let's go through the background first of why Airbnb is even researching this. Talk about lessons for researching squishy topics, which I'll explain a little bit, and then conclude with a model that was like the result of all of this research, the model that we use to inform the product strategy, and then also sort of a meta lesson about how to research these types of things. So first, the background. I want to start with a story. This is Singapore, and I have a story about Singapore. Here's the story. If you want to take the bus in Singapore, you can tap your smart card on the reader, you can pay with cash, or buy an all-day travel card. That's my Singapore story. Who thinks that is a good story? It's a horrible story. It's not even a story. It's just like tips. But that idea of like how to take the bus in Singapore is something that a participant in one of our research sessions talked about, who had gone to Singapore, and she was like, she had this great story, but then when we asked how she would tell the story, she's like, I think I'd tell people how to take the bus. But she had a really cool story. So here's her actual story. It was 10 years ago. She was traveling outside of China for the first time. She was from China. She didn't know English really at the time, and she was in Singapore and was told that in Singapore, it's okay if you don't speak English, even though that's like the main language. There's plenty of people that speak Chinese, so you should be able to get around just fine. Don't worry about it. She's in Singapore, exploring the city, and then it starts to get dark, and she realizes that she wants to go to her hotel. So she's looking and trying to figure out how to get to the hotel, but she can't figure it out. It's getting darker and darker. She doesn't know where the bus is, and she doesn't know how to figure anything out. She's starting to really freak out as it's getting darker, and finally she meets like an elderly gentleman at the bus stop, and he's like, speaks just enough Chinese that he can help her. He writes out instructions for how to get to her hotel, and when the bus comes, he even gets on the bus and tells the driver to like look after this woman, make sure she gets to this address. And this is her in the research session, her crying when she started talking about this moment where she met this stranger. She was like weeping, and it was like 10 years ago, but it still brought tears not because of the bus, that's like was irrelevant. It was because of the human connection she made with this stranger. But then when we asked her at like 2 minutes after this moment, we said, how would you tell the story? She talked about she would say how to take the bus. So what we realized is that when people try to tell stories, they're not usually maybe the best, because they tend to focus on what they did rather than how they felt. When she told us the story in person, it was like really emotional. Like I was not in the room, I was like behind the glass, but I was like super engaged. Like, oh my gosh, what a fascinating story. But then there's something that gets lost when she thinks about how she would tell it, because it's like people discount their feelings and think, oh, nobody wants to hear that. They just want to know how to take the bus. But actually, usually the most interesting part is in how people feel. Here's another example. This is from an illustrator named Maria Andrew. It's called Instagrammable Vacation Bingo, and it's sort of all the cliche Instagram shots you take on vacation. So there's palm trees against a blue sky, red rooftops, which Americans love when they come to Europe because we don't have those in the US, but it's pretty common in Europe. You gotta have a picture of that. Maybe some food, produce at a produce market, and then of course the Airbnb vignette. So it's almost like a cliche, and it's great. There's like 1.5 million posts on Instagram, #Airbnb, which is super cool. We love it. We'll take all the free publicity we can get, but Instagram doesn't let people tell like the full story and communicate the full meaning of what their experience was. So here's a diagram. If you think about it, the universe of experiences that you can have on Airbnb in a home or traveling in a neighborhood, near an Airbnb, and then what gets shared on Instagram, of course, there's not a perfect overlap, and a lot of the really good stuff just doesn't make it through. So whether it's Instagram or other social media or just a blog or whatever it is, a lot of times people focus on like articulating what they did, but they don't talk about the most interesting part, which is how they feel. So we'd like to help people talk about their travels more meaningfully, to really like allow that meaning to come through, the thing that really like resonated with them. And you might be thinking like, oh, great, but why is Airbnb doing this? It's like a booking site, you can book places. So this is emerged from some research we did about how sort of the travel planning process works. So some of the key decision phases here. All the way on the left, so destination is like the first thing you have to figure out, and that might take years because you might have something sort of baking in your mind. Then there's a flight. Sometimes you need a visa, especially if you're in China. And then accommodation is somewhere like sort of in the middle, and that's where Airbnb comes in. There's two sort of key things about this diagram. First, the diamond shape is like a design. Maybe you know it from like, I don't know, the London School of Design or something. But it's the idea of diverging and then converging. So the first part of this is diverging. It's all about opening up possibilities. And then about halfway through, once you book your flight, you start to like eliminate options and make a bunch of decisions. And Airbnb is, at best, it comes in like right at the cusp of that, where like it starts you start to limit options. And that's just not like, it's not ideal. There's a lot of strategic reasons that I won't talk about, but I think a good way to think about it is, as designers or researchers or whatever you happen to be, you probably, I always feel this, so I think it's pretty common, you always want to get involved in the product development process earlier, right? You always want to have a seat at the table like as early as possible. It's the worst when people come to you and it's like all the decisions have been made. It's sort of the same thing for Airbnb. Like if we can be involved in the travel planning process as early as possible, we can influence people's decisions more. And obviously we want more people to use Airbnb, so that's sort of why. So to get to that left part of the diagram, you need to inspire people. So we want to inspire people's travel plans. And if we think about what inspiration is, it's driven by meaning, by like emotionally resonant things. Here's another example from research. So this is a woman talking about how she wants to go to Paris. And she says, I just want to travel. I want to go to Paris the most because it's so romantic. The Gate, she's talking about Arc de Triomphe, and the Eiffel Tower. I want to spend my honeymoon there. My first impression of Paris came from a TV series called Yu Jianyi Lian Yumeng. And so that second part of the quote came when we asked why she wanted to go to Paris. And she's talking about the soap opera that she watched when she was a teenager. And I think the reason why she wants to go to Paris is because she likes the show. And the reason why she likes the show is because it was about these like emotional relationship drama things, which as a teenager is like, that's what's on your mind. So she watched the show when she was a teenager. It happened to take place in Paris, and now she wants to go to Paris. Paris means something to her because the show means something to her. I bet if that show took place in like Rome or Barcelona, she'd probably want to go to those cities. I don't think it's Paris per se. I think it's the fact that this show took place in Paris. That's what I mean by inspiration is like rooted in meaning. Okay, so inspiration is driven by meaning. How do we make travel stories meaningful? How do we make them more than just like an Instagram post or tips on how to take the bus? This is a simple model for thinking about how stories get made. So you start with an experience in real life. You do something. And then there's some element of reflection. You think about what you did, and then that gets like translated into a story. So that middle part, reflection, is where the translation happens. And in a way, like it doesn't really matter how good or how cool or how meaningful the experiences were when it comes to the story if you don't like properly reflect on it, if you don't like digest that experience into a story. So that reflection part is super critical. And if it's not done right or not facilitated properly, you won't have a good story. So reflection is where that meaning is made or not made. But reflection it's an abstract word. It's a squishy topic. Like, what does it even mean? So it's tricky to research. And that's what I want to talk about now is like, I'm going to take a detour into like lessons for how to research these squishy emotional topics, and then I'll come back at the end and sort of reveal what our insights were. All right, so there's a lot of research that I cover in here, and it didn't happen sequentially, but just so you know, like where all this is coming from. One part of the research was interviewing people that speak English, because I speak English only. In Paris and Copenhagen. I picked those cities because I happened to be there on vacation. And then a bunch of stuff in China, and I don't speak Chinese, I wish I did. So we worked with an agency, a really great one. But we went to all these different cities in China to understand, to do like in-home interviews, to do diary studies. We brought people into the lab and did a bunch of different like iterative studies, I don't know, over the course of like 6 months. And so there's bits and pieces from all these different research studies scattered in. You might be wondering, like, why China? Like, especially me, like, I don't speak Chinese. Like, what's the deal? The reason is that China has this, like, super mature ecosystem of story apps, travel story apps. The one on the left is called Mafengwo. The one in the middle is called Chanyo. Bread Trip is on the right. They've been around for several years, and they have, like, millions, hundreds of millions of users. It's like a thing that doesn't really exist anywhere else. So we thought, like, oh man, that's like the perfect place to go. Like, there's already people that are telling these stories. Like, of course, there's like travel bloggers everywhere, but this is like a whole nother level. So we thought it'd be super cool to go to China and really understand how people who write these stories go through that process of translating experiences into stories. So the lessons I'm going to cover are here. These don't make any sense yet, but hopefully they will when I get done. So the first one is about unfamiliar context and how that can help you get better insights. This is a couple that I interviewed in Copenhagen. They're from the US. And so this was like on the street. I met them at a cafe, wherever they wanted to meet. But I thought it'd be interesting to talk to them like while they were on their trip. Not while they're at home or not like in a lab, but I just thought there could be something really cool about sort of being like, I don't know, like at the scene of where all of the cool stuff's happening. So that was generally the research. This quote is not from that couple, it's from a different person. This is a person in Paris that I talked to, and he's talking about why he went to this specific cafe. I actually walked with him to the cafe, and the reason he chose that cafe, he says, all those people that were sitting out there in front of the cafe, for me, I don't know, it just looked like Paris. It was like his mental model of Paris was like people sitting in an outdoor cafe, which is like fair. Okay, cool. So that was his sort of experience. Another quote from a person in Paris. On Bastille Day, we stood about 400 meters away from the Eiffel Tower. We woke the kids up and went and listened to about a half an hour of classical music. It was spectacular and worth every bit of angst. Like he had to wake up his kids in the middle of the night. The girls loved it, absolutely loved it. That was a highlight. And then finally, this is another quote from a person in Paris. I love the fact that when you're in an Airbnb, it's a forcing function in some ways. You have to go to the grocery store, and I actually appreciate it because it gives you the opportunity to feel a bit more like a local as opposed to feeling like a tourist or traveler. So there's like 3 different examples of experiences people had while they were in this case, Paris. And if you map them out on this spectrum, you can see like on one end is touristy stuff, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just like things that tourists are more likely to do, but totally great. And on the other end is like more local stuff, like literally buying groceries. Like you have to do that if you live somewhere. But what was the interesting part of talking to these people while they were on their trip is that we realized that all of those experiences, even the touristy ones, were meaningful. Like no matter what they were, we realized it's like a relative thing. Like people who had never done something, when they did it, that was meaningful to them. And it didn't really matter what it was. For them, it was just trying something new. And I think, so the lesson here was that I think there was something about the unfamiliar context that like brought that out. It made it easier for people to talk about like this like abstract topic of growth and like what meaningful travel. It can be very difficult to talk about, but I think when people are traveling, they're sort of outside of their element and they're like receptors are up, they're taking in all these new signals and they're just like engaged with their emotions. So I think there was something about the unfamiliar context, i.e. like talking to people in a city that they had never been to, that like they were hyper aware of all the interesting things. All right, the second big lesson is about novel metaphors. So a lot of these quotes came from studies that we did in people's homes in China. This is an example where we had people open their laptop or their phone and just walk us through a story they had written and tell us, like, why did you write that story? What was the experience based in? We really wanted to go deep into, like, understanding that middle block, that reflection block. And here's a couple quotes. The pictures of the Northern Lights can be amazing. They have been PS'd. I want to see the real aurora, the Northern Lights. They're too good to be true. You must use your own eyes to witness. It's a clunky translation, but what's interesting about this is that phrase, they have been PS'd. And PS'd means photoshopped, but in like China, they say the word PS'd. Like that's like a metaphor to represent like it's too good to be true. It's like sort of a word that has grown beyond Photoshop. So I just thought it was an interesting metaphor. It was something that as soon as people started to say it, I was like, what, P.S.? Like, what are they saying that for? Shoot, there we go. Okay, here's another quote. This woman's talking about Japan. Through movies I've watched about homestays with local people in Japan, the benefit of a homestay is that it's a kind of warmth. It feels warm, maybe like some noodles and some sake. So here she's using this metaphor that's rooted in food to try to communicate this like feeling that she's not reflecting back, but she's sort of projecting forward, like what she wants to get out of a trip to Japan. And I just thought it was interesting that the metaphor she chose were these, it's like Japanese food. But the feeling she's trying to talk about reminds me of the Danish concept of hygge. I used to live in Copenhagen, and that's like a pretty trendy thing now. But it's just interesting because like a Danish person probably wouldn't talk about noodles and sake to talk about hygge. They would talk about like candles and hanging out with your friends and maybe, I don't know, it's dark outside. But it's the same vibe. But in this case, it's just a slightly different metaphor that the person was using to communicate a similar idea. And then this final quote. This is a woman who was only 19 when we talked to her, and she had this really great like perspective on the world. While in Sweden, I chatted with a local high school student about politically sensitive topics. She asked about human rights and voting rights. When I came back to China, I thought about what I should improve in this regard. In the past, I only watched the domestic news, but now I pay attention to international affairs as well. You should not only pay attention to your own country, that's vertical. We need to be horizontal. And this is another really interesting metaphor. I think it's beautiful, and it's cool that it came through the translation. And I don't know if it's like a widespread way of thinking about the world in China, but at least for this woman, it was like what I love about it is it was such a clear way to communicate what she was saying, what she was trying to say. Like the first part of it makes so much more sense when you add that metaphor. And it's a metaphor I had never heard before. So I really, like, my ears perked up. It really caught my attention. And so that's what I mean by these, like, novel metaphors. So, like, metaphors are ways to communicate concepts that are not easy to articulate, like very emotional concepts that are not rational. So I think metaphors are really interesting, especially new ones that you've never heard before, because they can help bring into focus something that's would otherwise be unclear, especially if it's like being translated and it's hard to grasp what they might be saying. So novel metaphors can make it easier to understand how the people you're researching like process the world. The third big lesson here is different baselines. Again, this is a shot from in people's homes. They're showing us their stories and talking about what travel means to them. And here's like a couple quotes from people reflecting on the things that like stood out to them on their trips. I wanted to go to the U.S. because I'd always heard about how developed the U.S. is, how complete the infrastructure is, whereas in China things are still developing. This is one quote, but like several people mentioned this idea of like development and like infrastructure, and it's just weird. Like I'd never heard anybody in the U.S. talk about that, but a lot of people in China seem to talk about it. here's a picture we collected in a diary study. And this, again, like I've seen several pictures like this from travelers in China. And we asked, like, well, why do people keep, like we finally asked someone, like, why did you take that picture? We've seen this picture a lot, someone sitting on a road. And they said it's because in China, you can never get this situation. There's people everywhere, there's cars everywhere. There's never an empty road, much less a road you can actually sit on to take a picture. So it's like so interesting that they have to capture it in a picture. Another quote, when we got onto the flight for Korea, like from Shanghai to Korea, we posted screenshots of the air quality in Shanghai and the air quality in Korea to make people, their friends in Shanghai, envy us. So in China, air quality is like, everyone's aware of it all the time because it's often bad and you have to wear a mask. And again, this is like something that probably not a lot of places in the world would be so aware of the air quality that they would use it as like a way to brag to their friends. But again, it was happening in China. And then the final quote, in the past I lived in Shenzhen, which is a very like tropical climate in southern China, but in Chicago, where this person visited, I saw the snow by the lake. I also walked in the snow for a long time, and after it thawed, it melted in the sunshine, and my shoes were all wet. In the past, I've never had this experience. So this quote doesn't quite do it justice, but when the person was saying this, it was clear that this was like a moment that really, like, I don't know, mattered to him. And he had never experienced snow, so like, and he's like an adult, so I don't know. I grew up with snow all the time in the Midwest, and to me, I would have never thought about this. But when he said it, it was just dawned on me that like, when you come from a different baseline, when you're like, the set of experiences that you're used to is one thing, obviously different things start to matter. The big lesson here is that when you talk to people or do research with people that have a totally different baseline view of the world, you can get deeper insights out of it. So whether it's the guy talking about snow or the picture of the person sitting on the road, all these things, like if we had done research in the U.S., we probably would have heard some interesting quotes, but they wouldn't have like triggered the same level of curiosity that these ones did, because it's like they're talking about things that seem so ordinary. Big deal, you sat on a road, or like, oh, whatever, snow. But like the fact that it was so interesting to them and so like otherwise uninteresting to me, again, that made that stand out that much more. So yeah. All right, so to wrap all this up, these are like the three lessons, like sort of meta lessons about doing research, especially for like the squishy topic of reflection. The unfamiliar context, novel metaphors, and different baselines. And I think what they all sort of help you do is like they prevent you from glossing over like stuff that is actually really interesting. And if you do, like, and this is specifically for these like very ambiguous, squishy problems, but if you sort of try to maximize the differences, the potential differences, I think it leads to better insights. It's different than if you're trying to study a very like defined problem. Like if you're trying to study, I don't know, how people complete an administrative task at the office, or how I don't know, some factory flow works. You would not want to remove people from that context. You would want to like study them in the most familiar context, because then you're trying to understand how they do their job. But here we're trying to understand how they think, and I like accidentally we like by doing these three things, getting people out of their context, listening for novel metaphors, and we happened to talk to people that had a different baseline view of the world. We didn't intentionally try that, but it turns out that it made the research that much more productive, and only after the fact did we realize that these were helpful. All right, so we did all this research about people's travel and their stories, and the model that resulted from all this, that we sort of synthesized everything into, is this pyramid of like layers of meaning, I call it. Seeing, thinking, feeling, and growing. And it's like a Maslow thing. Growing is at the top. It's like transformation or self-actualization. Seeing is very like superficial and just sort of about like enjoying the sights. And so I mapped out some of the quotes that were in there. So the pictures of the Northern Lights, that's like a seeing thing. That's just visually pleasing. Thinking is all these thoughts, these like rational analysis that we heard about like development in the US versus China. We heard people talk about Southeast Asia. It's sort of this rational thing. And then you get a little higher up, feeling, and that's doing something for the first time and like having felt something that you had never felt before, walking in the snow for the first time. And then it growing is sort of the ultimate, like if you can get there, it's the best. This metaphor about needing to be horizontal. And this woman completely changed her worldview based on this experience she had interacting with a local person. So this like framework of call it the layers of meaning has been helpful in informing products that we're building for China, but also for like the global, like the rest of Airbnb, like globally. There's a couple different products that are like being experimented with that I can't really talk about, but I think one thing that's cool about this is that it's not like we just did research in China for the China market, because that's typically how you might do stuff. You might be like, oh, we want to get a bunch of business in a given market, so we'll do research there, and that's fine. But I think what happened to be cool, we didn't plan on this, but because of like all these differences that I outlined between sort of like me as an American researcher and people in China using different metaphors and having different baselines, was that the insights were sufficiently like deep, but also universal. Like we've been able to so typically, people might do research in their home country, and then everything else is sort of a bonus. But in this case, the core insights came from this research in China, and I think it's at Airbnb we're always trying to be more inclusive and trying to represent like viewpoints beyond like San Francisco tech people. And this is like an interesting example of how like we didn't even do that much research with American people, but we're using the research to build products that are for people in China, people in the US, people in Europe, like everywhere. And I think it's because it was like this sort of inherently squishy topic that lent itself to doing research in a place that's not super familiar to me. And then the big like meta lesson, all these like research lessons, but I've talked about it before. For squishy topics, bigger differences, I think, lead to better insights. It's not like all research should always be done with super different situations, but for these types of problems where it's ambiguous and you don't even really know what you're trying to research, I think maximizing the differences, whether that's going to a different country, talking to people that speak a different language, or even, I don't know, if you can't travel, if it's just like local research, talking to people that are from a different part of the city or different socioeconomic status, whatever it is, trying to incorporate all these differences, I think will ultimately lead to better insights. This is just a summary, and that's it.
Hey, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah.
How about a few questions?
Yeah, please.
You game? All right, cool. And just a reminder, please submit your questions on Slido. I see them right here. I can ask on your behalf. Hey, thanks, JJ. That was fast. Let me see. Yeah, okay. So the question is really about outcomes.
Sorry, about what?
Outcomes.
Outcomes, yeah.
So you make these journeys and collect these stories, and then you bring them back.
Right.
How does it sort of translate into changes in the product?
Right, yeah. So this is like pretty high level research, and it was like influential in like the strategic visioning of the work. But like to Stephen's point about like doing more research like earlier, this research we did like at the very beginning of the product development cycle, and then as soon as we had anything we could put in front of users, we had all these like prototypes and ideas, we would incorporate that into the research. So there were like several rounds of research, all of which was both like high level, but also very like tactical, where we were trying to get feedback on prototypes, not only to iterate on the prototype, but to help us learn through that medium of the prototype. So there is like a version of these stories in the China app. Again, because the ecosystem is so mature there, we started there, and a lot of these insights are sort of baked into both the content the type of content that we have, and also like the length of the articles and the topics that are covered. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Got it. Okay, cool. More questions rolling in. Let's see. At one point, you said something about what sounded to me like a research-focused question.
Yeah.
Like, what does travel mean to you, or something like that.
Sure, yeah.
And I'm wondering, what's the process at Airbnb for coming up with those focus questions? Like, what's the process like for that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty, at Airbnb, we're lucky because research and design is like built into the heart of the company. Two of the co-founders are designers. So we're just like very integrated into all the different product teams and part of early conversations. So when we thought about doing anything related to stories, I don't know, I just thought it would be cool to do research on it, and a lot of other people agreed, and so we just, I don't know, decided to do it. I should also mention that these trips were not only for researching these stories. There were other aspects of whether like of China or of Paris and Copenhagen that we were incorporating into this research. So it wasn't just only about this. Mm-hmm. We always try to find ways to like leverage studies to give us more than just one output.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then there's another question on that one. I guess it sounds like some of the stuff is go out and sort of just explore and absorb formative kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then it turns into some sort of product something eventually somehow. And then I guess the question is, how do you go back and see if those theories that show up in the product are true or not? Right. How do you validate?
Right, yeah. I mean, we continue to do research. So like every month basically, there was some reason to do a study in China. So whatever state the prototype was in, or now the product is in, it's like just continually being researched and iterated on and changed and updated. So like one example where where some of the research, where there was like a disconnect between what came out of the research and then what happened in the product was everything I was talking about was about meaning and like these trying to emotionally relate to people. But we realized that if you put these stories in the Airbnb app, that's not the best place for that type of content, because when people come to the app, they just want to book a place. Like, especially in the app, they don't just land on the app accidentally. They came there for a reason, and it's to book. So putting the stories in the app is not the right place. Putting them outside of the app to bring people, whether it's on a site like Quora or any social media, bringing people to Airbnb, it turns out that that's a better use of these stories. And we had ideas, and we tried a couple different things, and then as we tested products in the real world, we've adjusted. So now, like in the product, the stories have like a slightly different type of content, and outside of the product, so we've sort of like refined our understanding of like exactly which content belongs where as we've continued to do research.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's a question from Anonymous. Thank you, Anonymous. I guess the gist of it is this. So you and your team get back from China to wherever your office is. Where's your base?
San Francisco.
San Francisco.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you've got all of your notebooks and all this stuff that you've collected, and your brain is swimming all this stuff. Right. How do you take all of that and convey it to a stakeholder? How do you kind of retell the story that it affects others?
Like a presentation similar to this. It's much longer and more in-depth, but I mean, the best way is to get the people to actually participate in the research.
Right.
We had some people in a lot of this research. There was always like an engineer or a designer or a I don't know, PM, product manager. But ultimately, there is like especially for something so foundational, a lot of it is like, I don't know, just a really putting a lot of work into like a deck to communicate, and then just being there to explain it and make sure people get it. Maybe do a workshop where people have to think through the insights and come up with ideas, not to generate ideas, but just to force people to think through the insights.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a bit of magic you do on the other side to sort of convey all of this energy back. Yeah, right. Awesome. So maybe one more question, and it's, I guess, maybe a two-parter, and it's about recruiting. The first part is, how often are you able to work with local researchers in these places that you may not be familiar with? So there's that one. And then the second one is sort of the obvious one. How do you find these people who are willing to hang out with you and open up their lives to you?
Yeah. So for the first one, basically if a researcher at Airbnb doesn't speak the local language, we work with an agency. It just happens to be that we've done a lot of research in Asia, China, Japan, Thailand. We've also done some research in Germany and France and I don't know, a lot of other. There's like 50 researchers, so people are doing research all over the world. Yeah, we find good agencies through word of mouth or however we do it, and that's it. What was the second part?
Well, it's just about finding participants.
Right. So, of course, if we're trying to recruit Airbnb users, it's sort of easy. We have their contact information, and I don't know. I think we're lucky at Airbnb. There's a very passionate, at least subset of people that really want to make the product better and are eager to help. It's just good old-fashioned recruiting. I don't know.
Yeah, there's no easy answer really. Right. It's just a lot of hard work.
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chris.
Yeah. Thank you.
And